All right, let's talk about something that pretty much powers our entire world, crude oil. But here's the thing, it's not just one substance. Think of it more like a big, complex family of liquids, and each one has its own unique story, its own job to do. So let's dive right in. Okay, just look at this picture for a second. On one side, you've got this light, almost honey-colored liquid, and on the other, it's basically a thick, black sludge. Believe it or not, they're both crude oil. So you have to wonder, right? If it's all supposed to be the same raw material, why do they look so incredibly different? And what do those differences actually mean for us?
So, before we can really get into the nitty-gritty of these different types of oil, we kind of need to zoom out and look at the whole journey. We're going to trace it from way down in the ground right up to your gas tank.
Yeah, the oil industry is just massive. It's this huge, multi-step process that starts with finding the raw stuff deep in the earth and ends with the fuel that keeps everything moving. And right at the heart of this giant global machine is crude oil. It's the starting point for everything. You know, the industry likes to break this whole thing down into three big chunks. First, you've got upstream, and that's pretty much what it sounds like, finding the oil and getting it out of the ground. Then comes midstream, which is all the logistics. Think pipelines, giant ships, trains, whatever it takes to move that raw crude to where it needs to go. And finally, there's downstream. This is where the magic happens, where that crude gets turned into gasoline, plastics, you name it. But for us today, we're focusing on step one, the raw material itself. Okay, so how do the pros actually talk about all this stuff? Well, they don't just say oil. There's a whole language they use to tell one type from another, and it all boils down to two really important things. Let's get into it. First up is something called API gravity. Don't let the name scare you. It's really just a fancy way of measuring how thick or dense the oil is. The American Petroleum Institute came up with the scale, and all you really need to remember is this. The higher the API number, the lighter and runnier the oil is. And this really makes it clear. You've got light crude on one side, it has a high API gravity, so it flows super easily, kind of like vegetable oil. Then on the other side, you've got heavy crude, low API, think thick, sticky molasses. And you can probably guess, that difference between vegetable oil and molasses makes a huge difference when you're trying to pump it out of the ground and turn it into something useful. All right, the second big thing we need to look at is sulfur content. And this is where the language gets a little weird. We start talking about oil being sweet or sour. And no, that has absolutely nothing to do with taste, I promise. It's all about the chemistry, and ultimately, the price. So here's the bottom line. Sweet crude, that means it has very little sulfur. That's a good thing, because it's way easier and cheaper for refineries to handle. Sour crude, on the other hand, is loaded with sulfur. That stuff is corrosive. It eats away at pipes and equipment, and you have to spend a lot of extra money to get rid of it. This is exactly why you'll always hear that light, sweet crude is the most desirable and expensive kind. Okay, so we've got our two main ideas now, density, or API gravity, and sulfur content, sweet versus sour. With that, we're ready to break down the four big families of crude oil. And let's start with the good stuff, the high-value crudes. First up is light crude. This is the premium stuff, really. It's not very dense, it flows well, and it's usually sweet. You've probably heard of the big names here, like WTI from the US or Brent from the North Sea. When you see oil prices on the news, they're usually talking about one of these. And because it's so easy to work with, it's the perfect ingredient for making the things we want most: gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel. All right, next we have medium crude. And yeah, it's pretty much what it sounds like. It's a little denser, a little thicker. You find this stuff in places like the Middle East. Dubai crude is a big one, and Russia with its Urals crude. It's often sour, so it's a bit tougher to refine. But think of this as the workhorse of the industry. It's great for making things like diesel, fuel oil for ships, and heating oil. Okay, let's flip to the other side of the coin now. We're talking about the heavyweights, the thick, difficult stuff that takes a whole lot more effort to turn into products we can actually use. So heavy crude is, well, it's heavy. It's got a really low API gravity, it's thick like that molasses we talked about, and it's almost always sour. We find huge amounts of this in places like Canada, Venezuela, and Mexico. Now, because it's so thick, you get what refiners call the bottom-of-the-barrel products out of it. And that's not an insult. It's literally the heavy stuff that sinks to the bottom during refining. Things like asphalt for paving roads, heavy fuel for container ships, and tough industrial lubricants. And this brings up a really interesting paradox in the oil world. You look at a map of who has the most oil, and countries like Venezuela and Canada are right at the top. They have the largest proved reserves on the planet. But a huge chunk of that is this heavy, difficult stuff. It makes getting it out and processing it super hard and super expensive. So it's a perfect example of how just having oil in the ground doesn't mean you can easily produce it. And that brings us to the most extreme end of the scale, extra heavy crude. We're talking about bitumen here. This stuff can actually be solid, like tar, when it's at room temperature. The biggest sources are in Venezuela's Orinoco Belt and the famous oil sands in Canada. You can use it as is for things like roofing, but to turn it into fuel, you have to put it through a really complicated and energy-hungry process called upgrading, just to make it into a synthetic crude that a refinery can even handle.
Okay, so we've gone through all the technical details, but why should you care? What does any of this mean for you? Well, it turns out that the kind of oil a country has versus the kind of oil a refinery needs shapes pretty much everything: global trade, the economy, and yeah, even the stuff you buy at the store.
And this is something that I think blows a lot of people's minds. We all think of a barrel of oil as becoming gasoline for our cars, right? But that's not even half of it. The rest of that barrel gets turned into the fundamental building blocks of modern life. We're talking plastics, the clothes you're wearing, fertilizers, shampoos, parts of your computer, you name it. It all starts as raw crude oil.